Welcome to the Triple D Podcast, Donuts, Disability, and Discourse, where host Michael Leiner talks to the best in the business about community, impact, business, and donuts. Here's your host, Michael Leiner.
Welcome to another episode of the Triple D Podcast, Disability, Donuts, and Discourse. I have a great guest, a good friend of mine, Tim Stallings. Tim, why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit, and then we'll talk.
Sure. Well, what do you want to know? So
Everything.
Everything.
Start at the beginning. What hospital were you born in, sir?
So obviously we know each other pretty well. I practice in the world of estate planning and elder law. So my office is over in Independence. Married, no kids. Been doing this since 2005. So at it for almost 20 years now.
Now, you're not from Ohio.
I grew up down in, they call it the historic triangle, Yorktown, Williamsburg, Jamestown. So if you haven't taken your kids there, you should. But down in like Southeast Virginia.
One thing that that you told me about before that I found so interesting was you were like a little local basketball star when you were in high school. And the league that you were in was filled with like big name athletes, weren't you?
Our high school district was, there were a lot of really good basketball players there. Allen Iverson, in other sports, Michael Vick, Marcus Vick. Back in the day, Alonzo Mourning. And
that has to be, Alonzo Mourning has to be way before your time.
Yeah, he's a little older than me. He's probably in his 50s. But yeah, the area, they call it the Peninsula and the South Side, Virginia Beach. Because there's a lot of military, it's kind of a transient area, but because sports are so big, people, when they get there, if they get involved in high school sports, they tend to stick around. So thankfully, I found my calling. It wasn't in the sports world. You know, it was in the legal world like you. So
did you always know that was your calling, though?
I don't know. I mean, you know how it is. You talk to your parents when you're young, and if you can develop a good argument, everybody says you should be a lawyer.
Yeah.
So,
that's what they tell all the assholes.
I'm assuming that'll be cut out for content, but
no, this is definitely staying in.
All right, we're on brand here.
There's no brand.
I don't know. I didn't actually go immediately to law school. I graduated in 2000, and then I went to D.C. and I worked kind of in the Richmond area as well for a couple of years it was for Dominion Resources, which is a big power conglomerate. Yeah. So I worked there and then kind of decided I wanted to go back to grad school, and I ended up at Case Western, so that was kind of my tie to Cleveland.
And now, you own with your partner, like probably the largest elder law firm in Ohio.
Yeah, I think so.
Let me ask this to you.
Sure. Did
you always know that you wanted to be an entrepreneur in that sense? Is that something that was natural for you?
I always liked to kind of work through problems. So when I saw something, if I could fix it, I wanted to do that. Obviously, that's part of being an entrepreneur is kind of opportunistic. And, we felt like elder law was a growing practice. It was relatively new, a lot of baby boomers. So we knew that we could help, folks like that.
Were there things that you started doing earlier on? Because, even if it was a newer growing practice with an aging population, you weren't the first elder law attorney. It's a practice area that's been there for a while, maybe not as niche as it is now, but were there certain things that you felt that you could improve on or do different than other people who were in that area before you started just attacking it?
Well, I felt like there was a lot of confusion. You get dealing with Medicaid and dealing with government entities. People often get lost, and if there's not, a way to make a lot of money, like a personal injury or something, attorneys, frankly, kind of shied away. I think what we looked to do, we knew we were going to be fixing the same problems for a lot of people. Yeah. So anything that we could do to use technology to bring efficiency to it would allow us to keep our prices, very competitive, but to give a much better experience to the clients from a communication standpoint, from a document standpoint. So that was where we thought we could gain some ground. and get some market share in the elder law space.
What was it like at the beginning? So, you and I were introduced at this point. You and I have YouTube videos from like 2016 or 2017, like
It's
a
been a while.
while ago. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I just remembered that the other day. But, I mean, at that point, you already had a, thriving practice with functional offices all over the state. But nothing starts that way. What was it like at the very beginning?
I mean, we often joke when I moved up here with my wife at the end of 2010, and after leaving a good job at a law firm down in Atlanta, it was different because now I didn't have a paycheck. So anything we could do for fun that was inexpensive, we would do. We used to
a lot of hiking,
bowl, and eat chicken fingers. That was like Friday night date night. But we were committed to any of the money that we were making, putting it right back into the business, which kind of helped us expand. We were in financial situations where we didn't have to rely on a paycheck, every month, and I think that really allowed us to grow the practice faster than it would have been if we were taking any of the profits that we made out of the business immediately.
And is that still a big part of the philosophy, just reinvesting?
Well, I think, from a coverage standpoint, we've gotten to a point where, we're growing more strategically. I think when we started down in Columbus, actually, and then, I've been up here since 2014 in the Northeast Ohio area.
Before you move on, because I didn't know this, so when you moved up here to start the practice, you were living in Columbus?
Yeah, so we lived in Columbus from 2010 till about the middle of 2014.
Okay.
And at that point, when we decided to, my wife and I decided to move up to Northeast Ohio, it was done because we knew when we had looked at done some analysis that Northeast Ohio had about twice as many seniors as Central Ohio. Columbus is just more of a cow town that's grown up.
Yeah.
So we knew there was a lot of opportunity here. We saw that there were some elder law firms, but it was a lot of 1- and 2-person type of shops where we knew that we could have a bigger footprint and there was a lot of opportunity.
Yeah. And so I started my own practice in 2013.
Okay.
So you came up here and, really set your roots here just 1 year after that. Both of us are not from here.
Right.
We're both transplants. I came from, the Detroit area, went to law school in Cleveland, and started my business after being in practice for a few years. But what do you think is special about Ohio that made you leave, first Virginia, then you were down in Georgia where your wife is from, and now you're up here. Why has this been a good climate?
Well, obviously the people. I think, Cleveland historically has, kind of been the butt of some jokes, but I think that's for people who haven't been here. And I think, there's pretty good support for businesses here. There's a lot of people who take pride in Ohio. They want to work with, folks from Ohio. And, the cost of living's pretty friendly. We have, it still feels like a big city. We have a lot of culture, a lot of opportunities. But, in terms of business itself, for me, Cleveland's much bigger than the city, the part of the country I grew up in terms of the number of folks. But, it kind of feels like a southern place in terms of people are hospitable. Once you're kind of in, I feel like it's Cleveland against the world. So, for us, it's been great. I had a conversation with my wife, ended up having to get some life insurance. And I said, if I passed, where would you go? And she said, I'd stay here. This is where our roots are. So I thought that was kind of telling. We've been here 10 years, but that she would stay, even though she doesn't have ties and she doesn't do business here.
Right.
So.
Oh, that's actually really interesting. And, you've kind of been on this growth trajectory watching and this is something that's interesting to me because this is kind of a business problem that I felt several years ago that we had conversations about that, frankly, COVID kind of fixed in the sense of you get to a point where, you're in a state-specific practice where at least unless you go and get barred in another state, correct me if I'm wrong, you can really only handle cases for people inside of Ohio. for me, I had a federal practice, and I got to a point eventually where I felt like I had grown in Ohio as much as I physically could. Like, really strong market share. We knew had the largest practice in Ohio doing what we did. I'd kind of knocked on all the doors that I could knock on. Now, COVID allowed us to expand nationally because our hearings aren't in person. They're virtual, and they probably will remain that way indefinitely. But what's the strategy for a firm like yours, where and I think this kind of even goes back to that reinvestment question that I asked earlier. Once you've like grown, what becomes the plan then? Because you want to stay on some kind of path
Sure.
towards growth. How do you do that?
Well, I think you can obviously grow by expanding your footprint, or you can grow by expanding your practice area. We weren't going to expand our practice area, but the third way you can grow is, to try and do more business in the offices where you are.
Yeah.
And I think we have the benefit now when you've worked with, I don't know how many families we've worked with now, probably, 8 or 9,000 or somewhere in that range. We now have a built-in group of people who know our systems. They've talked to us. They know, our philosophies. So now we've been, instead of spending money directly on, marketing, really using our existing client base to help us grow, to make, to drive revenue up in those respective areas. We've also, you can make money by, making more or spending less. So we've worked on efficiencies. We now have used some technology. So in places that are underserved in the state, where maybe we can't justify a full-time attorney, we can still have support staff there, televisions, video cameras. The client goes there, maybe at the first minute or two, they're like, wait a second, the attorney isn't here in person. But once they start engaging with them, then, it's like they're there. And they understand your other option is you're not going to get a specialist. You're going to get a general practitioner.
Or you're going to drive 2 or 3 hours.
Exactly. So, we've set up our offices strategically, and that's been beneficial. Elder law also lends itself to, we're also looking at financial situations, because when it comes to protecting assets from long-term care, we are looking at the assets that people have. Originally, we started a company called Golden Reserve, which was really designed to help our clients who maybe they didn't have enough money to justify a fancy financial advisor relationship, but they did need some help. And Golden Reserve came about to service those folks. In the last probably 3 years, Golden Reserve's really on a big growth trajectory. And obviously on the financial side doesn't really have the hurdles that we do on the legal side to cross state lines. So, right now, a lot of our focus is also on growing this company that's, kind of a sister company, if you will, and really focused. We don't use the word financial advisor. We use the word retirement planner, because we feel like when folks reach retirement, it's just a completely different discipline. There's all these new things you have to deal with. And, we've also seen some growth, on that side of the business.
What gets you excited every day? Because how much law are you practicing right now?
Yeah, I work mostly off of my existing clients who need new stuff, or if they send someone directly to me. Yeah. We have a really nicely trained staff of attorneys, so
right.
I get called in on the complicated things or something that's a one-off that no one's dealt with before, but not as much as I certainly was doing it all, at the onset.
And with that, I know how you've kind of directly or indirectly coached me over the years and offered me advice and different things. How much of your time is spent coaching your staff?
Oh, from a percentage standpoint, I probably am spending 25 or 30% of my day talking to coworkers or subordinates, trying to figure out, or just looking at ways where we can make small improvements, which obviously add to big improvements down the line. But I enjoy it. We have a system internally where each month we have an hour dedicated to anyone who you manage. And the idea is that, it's not just an annual review. So hopefully they feel like we're invested in their development, whether they stick around with us for 20 years or whether they, end up somewhere else. But we want to make sure that they know what the expectations are. We want to make sure we know where they're struggling so we can provide additional training. But the goal with the monthly meetings is there's no surprises when we do their annual review. They know the way they're trending. So, I get a lot of fulfillment out of, management or mentorship. I think you gave me a little too much credit. I feel like I just told you all the things we did wrong so you wouldn't do it. More than just telling you what to do. But I like people. So if I can see somebody else succeed, I don't look at it as competitive. I want everybody to do well.
How important do you think culture and spending that time with people and finding out what they get excited about and what makes them tick has been to the growth that you guys have had?
Well, we really struggled the first few years because I think when you have worked in a larger law firm where it's very cutthroat, if you don't like it, quit. There's a lot of people to take your job. It's just a different culture. It's still hard working, but no, I was just a cog in a huge wheel. And I think, what we made the mistake of the first few years is we kind of ran our law firm like the law firms that we came from, and that resulted in some things that we didn't expect and it weren't helpful, like a lot of turnover. And I think now we turned around and focused on culture. We took, I think, 85 people, something like that, to Cedar Point a few weeks ago because we hit some goals in our first quarter. So it was an awesome day. Get to know people better. We know who's afraid of roller coasters now. But we picked people up in different parts of the state. We all met. We had lunch. We rode rides for 5 or 6 hours, and everybody came home. But those are things that we try to do regularly just to kind of keep growing our staff from a cultural standpoint, so that when you have to have the tough conversation, people know you really are coming from a point of caring.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I want to go back to what you were talking earlier about the virtual setup. How important is being able to be face to face with an attorney in your practice, as opposed to like so much of what I do now, and this is even with client interaction, it's just over the phone, and clients have kind of adapted to that. Does your clientele require a different approach or a different level of care where they really value like the face to face interaction?
I think so. When you're dealing with folks who are approaching retirement or retired, they're not quite as technologically savvy as some of the folks you may be dealing with who are injured in their 30s or 40s.
Yeah.
Our clients still use smartphones, and we bring them on board in terms of communication in a little bit more intentional way versus just saying, hey, here's how it goes. But I think when we do get pushback, we explain to them, this is the world we live in. And I think for the most part, after a minute or two, they like to be able to see you. Of course, they'd like to be able to wring your neck if you don't do a good job. But, I think for the most part, it's been good for us, and it's allowed us to be more efficient. I don't want to spend 2 hours in the car. I'd rather spend 2 hours with a client, and they don't want to pay for somebody to travel. So, we kind of explain to them, here's the alternative. And then they say, okay, this makes sense.
Yeah.
And now technology is so inexpensive. A camera and a microphone and a television might cost you $400 or $500. It's not like it costs $5,000.
Sure.
So,
It's interesting to think though, just because when you and you referred to, when I talk about my clients, I really am talking about the client themselves. But earlier you mentioned you've worked with like 8,000 families.
Yeah.
So you really, it's not necessarily the individual themselves. It's almost their kids or their spouse that you're working with. Does that? I'm bringing that up because I'm interested in like the barriers that you have technologically to work with, which is by definition an older population. Has that been a struggle otherwise? And I'm talking not just the interactions with the attorney, but even just
the family.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's been that much different than our client. Obviously the client, when you're an attorney, you have to identify your client, but there's often other folks who are involved in the decision-making process. So we use Microsoft Teams, and it's been the adult children generally have no issue with Teams because in their day-to-day work they've used Zoom and Teams like that. But because the client themselves often come to the office, they don't really have to do anything, and then we can Teams in, if you will, the attorney and or a child. I like to be able to read body language because whether it's in person or over a video, because sometimes people won't ask questions that are there. You can kind of see the processing that I couldn't necessarily know about in my industry if I was on a phone. So I think the expectation is still I want to sit face to face with the attorney in estate planning. Um, so the closest we can get is the 40-inch television with a camera mounted on top, and we put it at the end of the table, and the clients have been receptive to that.
When you mentioned Microsoft Teams a second ago, I smiled because I remember back in, before the pandemic happened, you had already implemented that technology, and you would talk to me about how you would interact with your teams in other parts of the state using Microsoft Teams. And at the time, it sounded like, what planet is this guy on that everything's virtual? It sounded so foreign to me. But you were just ahead of the game because we were all forced into that.
Yeah, I mean, we were forced into it just because we're spread out. Like you mentioned, we have, and it kind of dovetails with the culture question too. We have a lot of people, but they're not all under one roof. So I can't just walk down the hallway and grab somebody. All of our communication is very intentional. So, we, and I can't take credit for this. I mean, Greg, my business partner, and, he knows a lot of folks on the consulting side who had looked at kind of how we had implemented it, and we got some coaching up. And, we have channels for, based on your position or region, et cetera, for communication purposes. But with the cameras, we were using that internally for our communication long before we started implementing it on the client side. So for us, because our staff was already so familiar with using that, it was very easy to get the clients on board.
I'm curious because, and I mentioned this earlier and you downplayed a little bit, but there have been many times over the years when I've gone to you for advice on things or I've always respected the way that you built your business. But when you have questions, when you're looking for advice or ideas, where do you go? It could be a person, it could be a resource. I'm just curious where you've garnered this knowledge that allowed you to grow.
So, wow. So there's a few different ways that I, try to learn and improve. And honestly, in the estate planning and elder law space, there's not a whole lot of visionaries. It's not where entrepreneurs often land. But it was my dad for a while. Now that he's a little bit older, I have some other male role models in my life. Obviously, I have a business partner who I trust implicitly. But at the course where I play golf, I've met some really strong, smart business folks who, I have my little personal board of directors, if you will, that I can bounce things off of when I'm making a big life decision, or even when I'm struggling with something with the staff. How would I deliver this message?
You said that, he's getting older, so now, you don't necessarily go to him like you might have years ago, but sure. What's the background there and what, because I think that probably helps tell some of the story about why you were choosing to take risks and move a few times to get where you are now. What type of influence did he have?
I think he's a man of few words, but he definitely bestowed a lot of wisdom. Some I accepted immediately.
He's efficient with the words he uses.
Yeah, I mean, he lost his mom when he was 18. His dad died right before I was born, so he's probably in his early 30s, and I think he had to grow up. I'm still blessed to have both my parents, and I'm 45. But he had to kind of grow up fast. He was the youngest, and he had to put himself through school, and he worked as a pipe fitter. So kind of learned a trade and made his way up. He's the millionaire next door who, never made a ton of money in a single year, but invested and, gave his 10% back to church. And, that was the guy he was. He was stern in terms of, the bar was set high, and if I didn't reach it, I knew in terms of my behavior and things like that as a kid. But I always felt loved. I really just never wanted to disappoint him. And then as I got older, he was very influential in my life decisions. So, my decision to go to University of Virginia, I was looking at some other schools, my decision to go to law school, deciding which law school to go to based on scholarship and stuff like that. I feel like he did a really nice job of leading me, but I still felt like I made the decisions.
Yeah.
And he was using a method, I don't even know if he would know the word, but it's called the Gestalt method. And whenever I would ask for advice, he never really told me what to do. He would always relate it to something that had happened in his life, so I could kind of take what I wanted from it, but I never felt like it was like, this is what you need to do. It was like, well, when I was in a similar situation, here's how I went through the thought process, and this is what I ended up doing. And I felt like I didn't even know what the Gestalt method was back then, and I'm sure he doesn't know what it is either. But as I've read about ways to make decisions and lead, I had come across that, and I was like, that's kind of what he did. And so I always felt like it was my decision. But for instance, I remember the first time I had to let somebody go, and I said, Dad, how do you go about this? I know you have to fire people. And he was like, well, is there any doubt that this person should be, let go? And I said, no. He said, well, you need to walk in there, and the first thing you tell them is, I'm sorry, but today's your last day. I'm here to walk you through, what needs to be done. We're not here to debate whether or not they're staying. So don't even open up that door. Don't tell them that you know how they feel, because this could be the worst day of their life. Just be direct, have enough empathy, where you're not going to make it hard for them. But, to me, that was what I needed to hear, because I didn't want to do it. It's like the hardest thing you have to do.
Do you use the Gestalt method yourself?
I try to. So, even when I'm dealing with my wife, and there's a decision, she doesn't want me to say.
Wives love things like Gestalt theory, and you're not gestalting me right now, are you? Because I'll walk right out of this.
So it's a positive thing, right? Instead of me saying this is what you should do at work, if she's having an issue, I say, well, when I face this, here's how I did it. And I think that is much more than me fixing her problem. She's asking me my thoughts. I'm telling her about, what's happened in my life. And then I think it's been better for our relationship. There's no book on, maybe there are books, but I didn't read them, on how to be a good husband. So I always want to fix the problem. Where really she just wants me to listen and maybe kind of have some empathy. So
it's so interesting because I love the direction of this conversation about different ways of managing people and sorting through problems. What I tend to do in certain circumstances, I just want to solve it. I think it more has to do with my mood on the day that it happens. But when I'm able to be patient with something, I just ask a lot of questions. Well, what are your options? What do you think the best one might be? If you had to rank them, what would be the easiest? What would have the largest impact on whatever the question or decision is? But I love that we put a name on, and there is a name for that decision making and how it's actually influenced what you do with other people. It's I think the part that I like about that the most is your dad's not a lawyer. And he's not, I don't know, we didn't get to where his career finished, even though you told me how he started. I mean, very different, but the way that he approaches problems has influenced the way that you do as well, and that's really cool. Well, I'm so grateful that you took the time out of your very busy golf schedule to be here and talk to us today. This is, of course, as I say in every episode, the Donuts Disability and Discourse podcast. So I don't have chicken fingers, and we're not going bowling after this, but I did bring
I can peek in
a
here.
donut for you. I chose the fruitiest one that I could find for you.
Thank you.
I think it matches your shirt, sir.
My sprinkles?
your sprinkle
Are we
shirt.
cheersing?
This is a chocolate sprinkle donut from Goldie's Donuts. We're here at Rising Star. Tell me what you think. Did I pick a good one for you?
I like it. I like a good cake donut. Sprinkles make me feel like I'm not 45.
That's right. That's right. You're not 45 at heart. That's what I've learned about you. I was actually shocked when you first told me how old you were.
It's the hair.
You don't seem your age.
Might be the Botox. I don't know.
I think it's probably more the Botox and just the comb. But see, at this point, I'm rocking the hat. Because if I took off my hat, you'd know how old I was. So wearing the hat, I could be anywhere between 16 and 32.
There you go.
Even though I'm not. But thank you for being here, Tim. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Keep attacking that donut, no problem.
Hey, this is my lunch.
Thanks for listening to the Triple D Podcast, Donuts, Disability, and Discourse. Rate, subscribe, and tune in next week for more Discourse and Donuts.